I just got back from the gym and I was watching some guy posing in the mirror, like taking his top off and posing. And I was thinking to myself, what a fucking dick. And then actually, the more I reflect on it, the more I think I'm probably struggling with and have always been struggling with my own issues with body dysmorphia. And it's weird because I don't think I've ever really given that much thought before. Things like I don't know why this is. I don't know why there's this kind of stigma bias around this, but I always think of kind of like body dysmorphia as being more of an issue that kind of women face, right? With all these models in the magazines and the skinny models and whatnot. I've never really seen or heard it talked about for men. Like it's just not something that really crosses your mind. But when I was thinking back to when I was at school, I had major issues with body dysmorphia. I was literally just looking up the definition now, and it basically says that it's an over preoccupation with your own body and how you look. And I mean, for me growing up, there were several things here, right? One of them was I've always been super hairy, for one, and I have very vivid memories of being not bullied, but having things said to me by girls at school, because back, like, bear in mind, I was like 14, 15, right? So it was kind of like, it was weird for a guy to be so hairy. And I remember some little snarky remarks from girls back then, and that really stuck with me. And after that, actually, I remember like always wanted to cover up. I always wanted to cover up my forearms. Like you can see my forearms are super hairy. So I always wanted to like cover up. I never wanted to like take my top off for ages because I was like so embarrassed about my hairy back and hairy chest. And it was really embarrassing. And to the point, because I've got hair all over me, if I was to shave my chest, it would just look bizarre because then I've kind of got super hairy legs or whatever, right? So you kind of just have to shave everything. And then it's like, then I just look weird. The way I dealt with that was by just trying to cover up as much as I could. I'd wear hoodies and jumpers and things, even in like really warm weather. And I was just like sweating underneath them. And that's something that has stuck with me. And I find myself even now, like, still doing that. And I'm like, why am I doing that? And it's this just like thing it made me realize how much these experiences and um, traumas, small t traumas, whatever you want to call it, do actually stick with us, right? And that, I mean, that was just one part of the equation, though. The other part, and I remember this was kind of more into my 20s when I really started getting into weightlifting. And I was obsessed with like bodybuilding. I used to read all the bodybuilding magazines, all the bodybuilding forums. I was taking all these like supplements and mass gainers and things like that. And I was just obsessed. I was going to the gym like religiously. I was probably just massively overtraining in hindsight, right? Um, and I was having like, broccoli and chicken obsessively for like every meal, packing lunches to work, like crazy, crazy obsessed. And I actually remember what one of the big reasons I kind of got into this was because when I was around 18, 19, I went through a period where I just completely went off the rails. I got super fat. I was like 17, 18 stone or something crazy like that. I always had like, I was as what you'd call kind of skinny fat, if you've ever heard the expression skinny fat, right? Where my arms would never put on weight, but all the fat would go to my stomach, which is like the last place you want it to go. And I remember being so annoyed all the time because I'd see my friends and they would put on weight, but it would be evenly distributed around their whole body. So if anything, they actually look quite good. They look like they're bulking up and getting quite beefy. Their face looks fuller. So they actually, they just look good in general. Whereas for me, it wouldn't go on my arms, it wouldn't go on my legs, it wouldn't go on my face, it would just go on my stomach. Right. And I was so frustrated by that. And I remember looking up all these things obsessively, and I was, even looking into surgeries and things at one point, and then when I lost a whole bunch of fat and then I just went really skinny. And then when I was trying to put back on weight, it was kind of going to my stomach, and I used to get really annoyed, and I was trying to find all these ways that I could not gain fat or eat enough of a calorie surplus where I was putting on muscle. And I did eventually get to a pretty good balance there. But even then, just even talking about it now, thinking about just the level of obsession that I had over my appearance, right? And it's so crazy to think about, and the insecurity that was there, because it does, like, that's where it comes from, right? It comes from this place of insecurity. I remember another thing, really like vivid memory as well. I don't even know where this came from necessarily, but I was always really embarrassed about having skinny arms, right? And particularly like the forearms, because I think for guys, it's like, we're wearing t-shirts a lot of the time, right? So when you got like nice, big, like muscly forearms, it kind of like, it doesn't matter if your like biceps are smaller because you just look bigger. Whereas like for me, I actually always had like quite big shoulders, right? And my kind of, when I was really going to the gym and working out a lot, I had really big like bicep peaks. But, and this was another thing I remember like obsessively like studying this on how like the bicep insertion point. I'd look at some of my friends who didn't train at all, but their biceps starts at the connection of the forearm, right? Like exactly where the forearm starts. So when they're wearing t-shirts, it kind of looks like they've just got this nice bulge, and it's like, oh yeah, that looks really good. And for me, my bicep was always like started higher up on the arm. So if I had a t-shirt on, you just saw these skinny forearms and then this skinny upper arm. And I was so frustrated about that. And I actually remember, like, I was watching a few videos and I saw some guy talking about this and saying like, actually, the insertion points of the muscle are kind of genetically decided. Like, you can't choose where that insertion point begins. Like, that in large part is just genetics. Sure, you can increase the size of the actual muscle tissue, which is what weightlifting will do. You can increase the size and volume of that muscle, but it's not going to change where the insertion point begins. And I remember after that, I was like, no, no. And again, I was looking into like, is there ways of like, is there surgeries you can get to change the insertion point and all these things? And I think about it now and I'm like, God, like, such a crazy level of obsession driven by this insecurity and self-image and just caring what people think. And I think even now though, even now when I think about that, that is still very much there for me. It doesn't affect me anywhere near as much as it did back then, but it absolutely still does. And it's such a real thing. And this video isn't all kind of doom and gloom, because what it did get me reflecting about afterwards, I was actually having a conversation with someone about this last night, in how all of these things, body dysmorphia, maybe it's like a work ethic that you have. And this is actually where I was thinking a lot of this came from for me, because I always thought, and one of the big reasons I think I got into bodybuilding as well, and one of the reasons I really was obsessed with bodybuilding, is because I had always felt like somebody's body, like, a really well sculpted physique is a representation of that person's determination, commitment, and focus. And being somebody who grew up with ADHD and was always being told, you're lazy, what's wrong with you? Why can't you do these simple things? They are kind of these ingrained and embedded, almost like micro traumas that follow you and almost dictate who you're going to become later in life. And I think so many of my actions, and again, pursuing, like, wanting to get into bodybuilding, that was me trying to prove those people wrong, and even prove myself right, right? That, no, I can do this. I can have that. And to me, bodybuilding was the ultimate way of doing that, because again, that physique was the physical representation of like, fuck you, I told you so, right? That to me was just the pinnacle of how I could do that. And again, it all stems back to that. Sorry, back to what I was saying, is that it kind of comes full circle to this, you know, everything we are, everything any of us are today, there are always pros and cons. There are always dark sides to our personality, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we're so obsessed with trying to fix traumas or change traumas or resolve them or be these kind of fully healed beings, right? But a lot of the time, those traumas, the flip side of them, they can result in positive behaviors. That work ethic, that dedication can also be an amazing thing to help you achieve amazing things, to help you build amazing relationships because of your level of commitment. And maybe if you didn't have that trauma earlier in life, you wouldn't be so committed. So it's this thing of like the amazing thing about the world and just people and humanity in general. We're just this big melding pot of different, traumas and experiences and personality traits, right? Everybody is different, and that's what makes people just so amazing. That's what makes this world so amazing, because we're all just so different. We all have our own unique magic, our own unique personality, our own, unique gift to give to the world. And if we were to remove all traumas, when you think about this obsession we have these days with kind of like healing and resolving traumas and whatever, if we were fully healed, I genuinely don't think we wouldn't be a person anymore, right? They talk about this in like yogic scriptures of how, you know, your personhood, like you can't detach that from the ego. To be a person, there is always going to be an ego there. I think it was, I don't know who it was, one of these spiritual gurus, maybe like Sadhguru or someone. And he said this really fascinating thing once, and somebody asked him, well, like people like Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, and used to say in there about how when these gurus or yogis would become fully enlightened, they would, I think it's a state of samadhi where they leave their body because they no longer have this karmic or egoic attachment to the self. So they just die. Basically, they die is what happens, right? They just shed their body and die because there's no attachment to the physical realm. And I think Sadhguru said once, like you kind of, with any guru, you choose to keep a level of attachment to exist within this physical realm. And it's like we're heading toward something, but I don't really think we understand what we're trying to head toward. And it's almost like maybe we just need to learn to accept ourselves for the wonderful bundle of traumas that we are, right? Because that's what it comes down to. The thing that happens with trying to fix or resolve anything is you actually just create more discomfort in yourself by nature of thinking about fixing, improving, resolving. That suggests that there is something to be fixed. So by the very nature of doing that, you are creating this consistent, constant state of unease, right? About that something's not right here. Whereas maybe there is this kind of perfect equilibrium. Right? I think about this as well with even, bacterias and the whole talk of like the gut microbiome and how, there is a mix. Like I remember seeing this video recently, or maybe a podcast I saw, and they were talking about how actually um, bacteria, like exposure to even bad bacteria, is good because it can help to create a diverse, and that's the key, a diverse microbiome that can fight off infections. Whereas if we're super clean and we're super hygienic, actually we can become very fragile and receptive to, or not receptive, but vulnerable to those bad bacterias, right? So it's kind of like for everything, I think there has to be this stable equilibrium. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to share that. But firstly, just to acknowledge, and for anyone who can maybe relate to these feelings, because I don't feel like it is talked enough about, especially for guys. I've seen lots of things like with women talking about it, but I've never really heard guys talking about it before, and it only just really got me thinking about it today. I was like, is that after seeing that guy and then reflect on myself, and then I thought, like, is that like body dysmorphia? And I googled the definition. I was like, holy shit. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, wow. So, hopefully, if there's any other guys out there who have experienced or are experiencing a similar thing, I think I still have it now to an extent, right? But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay to have these weird things about us, and maybe not beating ourselves up about these things and trying to fix these things all the time is actually, maybe that's what we need.